All right, well, it's 11 o'clock, so I'm just going to give 2 or 3 minutes for people to join, as people are typically bouncing from another call, as you guys are aware. But for those of you that are on, thank you for being prompt. Okay, so it looks like we have about almost a quorum. So I think we're gonna kick off, and that way people only miss your introductions, but they can always Google or LinkedIn find us. So for those of you that have joined, thank you for joining our webinar on legal operations considerations for biotechs. We're excited to have Scott Akamine and Chris Moore with us. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, but I think what is really helpful for this audience is both of these gentlemen have come from, both startup biotech backgrounds as well as large pharmaceutical backgrounds. So they are, keenly aware sort of the way legal operations affects organizations from the earliest stages to what I would say are some of the most mature stages. And just to start with the introductions, so I'm Karl Dorwart. I lead Factor's life sciences practice. For those of you that are not aware of who Factor is, we're an integrated legal services company. We have about 500 lawyers globally. We specialize in all things contracts and contracting across the entire CLM lifecycle. So helping companies with episodic contracted challenges like getting a phase 2 or phase 3 trial off from a CTA perspective, M&A, privacy-related remediations, all the way to longer state team building, sitting and integrating with our clients to help them with day-to-day contracting. And what's arisen out of that is, given that we kind of tie in with organizations of different sizes at different scales at different times in their maturity, we help a lot of organizations look at optimizing their technology roadmaps, looking at integrating, optimizing processes and workflows, and a lot of triggers that can fall into a legal operations role, where in a biotech you might not have that, all of those capabilities, but you might be thinking about them. So I'd love to start with Chris Moore, since I see on the top of my screen. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and give a little background on sort of your journey with and in legal operations.
Sure. I'm the chief legal officer at a small startup private company called Umoja. We're a gene therapy company hoping to democratize CAR T therapy by making the CAR Ts in vivo using a lentiviral particle. Before that, I was at CGen, and that's where I was first exposed to legal operations generally, and Factor in particular. And at CGen, I headed up what we call transactional law, the contract function, which covered all contracts from strategic transactions down to routine operations. And we were fortunate enough to go through a period of rapid growth. And so really I was compelled to start thinking about legal operations. I didn't even know it was called that, if I'm truthful. But there was just a pain, and that pain was rapidly increasing volumes of contracting, in particular for clinical trials, but also lots of strategic deals that were pulling me one way. So I was getting pulled two ways. If you like, the more routine operational contracts were growing rapidly, doubling year over year. But at the same time, we were doing these a number of strategic transactions that were taking up a lot of my time. So I always think of like an in-house legal department as almost like a spear, you know, and there's the point of the spear, which would probably be these strategic transactions, whether it's a deal, whether it's a financing, a litigation. It's something where probably resources are always available because it's just so important to the organization, and you can rally support for it, but they take up a lot of time. And then if you like the more routine work, um, the service side of an in-house legal department, which might be the operational contracting, might be the care and maintenance of patents, might be SEC compliance as opposed to financing. Think of that as the shaft of the spear, and they're competitive. They compete for resource, and they compete for, at Seagen, they were competing for my resource. And so I was compelled really to start thinking about, well, how do I do this? And frankly, I was fortunate enough to stumble into some external help that used this phrase legal operations, and it's been a journey since then just to start learning about it. And then when I came to Umoja, you know, I joined in September of 2021 when the biotech market was still very frothy, and almost immediately the biotech market entered a period of, man, it's just hard to raise money. And that just compelled, for different reasons from CGen, it compelled me to think about stewardship and how I steward the resources that I do have that have been more modest than I hoped and not likely to increase. So it's kind of like, how do you get more out of what you have? And so again, that compels you to start thinking about how we do things. And in particular, that kind of shaft of the spear, the more service side of the legal department, because you don't really have to worry about the point of the spear. You'll always get results for that.
That's really helpful. And Scott, would love you to pick up on this theme as well. You know, introduce yourself and your background and kind of your journey and how you think of legal operations.
Sure. Scott Akamine, the Chief Legal Officer of Cerevel Therapeutics. We're a public development stage neuroscience company. We have a variety of assets across the development spectrum. We have a few phase 3s running, a handful of phase 2s, phase 1s, and a development stage pipeline as well. Before this, I was the legal department of, and I should mention, our department today is 8 people plus myself, with a contract, 2 contracts managers and a legal operations manager. So we'll put that aside for now. The last company that I was at was a development stage, also neuroscience company, private, and I was legal department of 1. And then kind of jumping back a few that's most relevant here, I was at Allergan, where I was first introduced into the legal operations space. A little bit unwillingly, if I'm being honest, but we had a little bit of a conundrum as we were also going through a growth period, as Chris mentioned, and it seems to be a genesis of a lot of these issues, where you go through a growth period and you realize the foundation upon which you build your contract structure and how you operate the business is not capable of reaching the scale that you need it to. And so in that instance, we had a pretty hardy in-source group. I think there was about 15 professionals that were dedicated to managing contracts at Allergan. And this was the Allergan before it was acquired by Actavis, so back in the early teens. And we went through a bit of a transformation there to reimagine how we thought about doing contracts and went to a hybrid in-source outsource model. And that was kind of my first learning into how to think about that part of the business a little bit more strategically. And then I would say the output of that project was a lot more credibility within the business. And I've taken that with me through, my my current job and my last job, which was the thinking that it's nice to do the tip of the spear stuff that Chris mentions, and you're always going to get resources for it. And you're always going to make your way into the boardroom to have those types of discussions. But within the business, I think that you don't have the credibility to do more strategic thinking within and be a true business partner if you can't get the blocking and tackling done of the day-to-day operations of what it takes to support those parts of the business.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. So, that you guys pick up on a number of themes, but the one that I think would be relevant, because we do have, again, in the audience, we have biotechs of various sizes, and we have, large pharmaceutical companies who probably have pretty well-established legal operations, functions and models, as do you now, Scott. If you are, an early stage biotech, and let's say, Scott, party of one, or Chris, one plus a few, but again, you guys always sort of come in as kind of, individuals trying to figure out what I need to do first. When would you advise, one of your peer companies to start thinking about legal operations? And Scott or Chris, Chris, you went first, so Scott, I'll let you take this one first.
Sure. I similar to Chris, didn't know that legal operations was an actual thing. I found myself first at Allergan being a little bit overwhelmed by a project that leveraged almost zero of my law school training, and realized that I probably should have gone to business school if I was going to try to solve these types of problems. I quickly learned that it was just the process of sorting out your work, prioritizing your work, and then driving the right work to the right resource. And so it was almost easier when I thought about it as a department of one. So if there are folks here that are a department of one, you control your own calendar, you control your day, you control a bit of kind of how you prioritize your own projects. And then you realize very quickly that you only have a finite number of like actually good productive thinking hours in a day that are, external to meetings. And you realize that you can preserve that work for yourself and that thinking for yourself, and you got to figure out what to do with the other 100 hours of work that you have on your plate. That process for me was pretty illuminating in terms of how I thought about legal operations as I got to a slightly bigger scaled company. And so where I got to be a bit transparent in terms of kind of an operating model was I would try to keep the most interesting stuff. And that was a little bit selfish of me, but it was also what I figured that they actually hired me for. And then I went about trying to figure out what processes I needed to put in place in order to drive the rest of the work to the right place to get it done in a way that I felt comfortable with it, since it ultimately rolled up to me. And then you're also then managing, what is the right cost structure? What is the right resource? Is this sustainable? How repetitive is this work? But to me, it was really just a function of where do I start? Was I have too much work in my inbox and I don't know how to get it done. And so once you find yourself there, which is probably the second day of your job, you then go about the process of thinking about how to allocate the right resource to that work to get it done effectively. And I have since learned that you can call that legal operations, and this sounds a little bit more thoughtful.
Yeah, we approach, when we're engaging with our clients, we approach legal work very similarly in terms of you mentioned keep the interesting stuff. How can you leverage, how can organizations leverage technology? How can they think about their resourcing strategies? How can they think about the types of work they're doing? What else is out there, so that they can be, they being the in-house lawyers, the most strategic with the business, but also, which, as you mentioned, is critical, especially at, at a biotech phase. I have a lot of buddies from law school that are in life sciences, and all of them, have sort of transitioned into the biotech world, coming from very large pharmaceutical companies. And that has been their, I wouldn't say surprise or necessary struggle. I think it's more of the most interesting part of their job is they really have to transition quicker to becoming business minded and business centric. Yes, they have the responsibilities that a lawyer would have as being the first or sole general counsel, but they're constantly getting pulled into, you mentioned, both of you guys mentioned, financing. And a lot of these folks are coming out of the traditional role where you understand all of those nuances, but now you have to become, a finance lawyer, or you have to, you're going on the road shows to drum up business. So you're engaging more with, private equity potentially. So I think, we think that similarly from a lens of how can we help the lawyers and the organizations. And this is also true in big organizations, maybe even more true because you have so many lawyers and they're doing some of them are doing a lot of the same work. How can they enrich and grow within their organizations by being more strategic with the business? And a lot of that is thinking about the way the work they're doing today is getting done. Are there more efficient ways to do it? Are there other levers they can pull, whether it's externally or internally, or again, technology, which we'll touch on. So that, I think we approach some of that with the same mentality. And then Chris, would love your insight as well in terms of, again, coming from a large, super fast growing corporation, which unless you live under a rock, people would not know, got acquired by Pfizer for $43 billion. So, major, one of the biggest transactions we've had in the last several years, to coming to Umoja, where, you're on the ground floor looking from day one, so what if you had to counsel, your peers in terms of when to start thinking about legal operations, when would that trigger happen for you?
So I would encourage people to start early and start small. Just, I mean, if if a ramp or wheel is technology, then so is a template and a playbook. So I think there are pretty simple things that I think you can start thinking about. We had a prior meeting to plan for this, and Scott said something that was simple, but it was powerful. It was like, if you do anything more than once, you should think about how you're doing it. And and so again, I get like a template, a playbook, so it's something like that. And that sounds really basic and no duh, but having a sort of small library of them, and particularly the playbooks, I think is very powerful, because if you hit one of those growth inflection points, then all of a sudden, you're just like surviving on fumes, and then all of a sudden you hit one of these inflection points, and it's grow, 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 and you finally get to onboard people, and they're doing the best, and maybe so it's funny, right? Then you're going and you're recruiting at a time when you're like ridiculously busy, and and you have these really important decisions to make, and maybe you do get somebody, and hopefully there's somebody good, and you throw them in, and the very first question is, well, what's our position on? And now all of a sudden, they're not actually taking anything off your plate, because you don't have an artifact to give them. So, even something simple like that, I think, is great. And I would, if there are very sort of simple technologies, maybe think about them. I mean, I think you've got to think about your return on investment. Again, going back to what Scott said about thinking like a business person, I think you've got to get familiar with that way of thinking and some of those terminology. So you can even talk about it with your your colleagues in other departments. I mean, they're not lawyers, and more sort of legal-based arguments of kind of fear-based arguments. So if we don't have it, we might get in trouble, tend not to resonate with them, because it's so easy for them to say, oh, give me an example when somebody got in trouble because they didn't have I don't know, we've got a basic technology, PatSnap. And, you know, it's a modest cost per year, but now all of a sudden, the one other member of the legal department is a patent lawyer, gets to get alerts. And when our competitors, people she's identified as a competitor, file a patent, she gets to go and look at them, and I get to say, if we didn't have that, she would have to have an outside counsel basically have those alerts and tell her. And inevitably they take a quick look at it before they did. And all of a sudden the cost would be so much more. And then I get to point out, oh, and remember we had that call with that potential investor who asked us if we kept track of our competitors' filings. And we were able to say, oh yeah, we do. We have alerts. And so I think you've got to start thinking like that. So start early, start small. As Scott suggested, if anything is repeated, think about it. And even things like templates. I mean, for most of my career, there might have been some templates, but they were always out of date. Everybody had some alternative language that they had on their desktop or someplace, and it had never been updated. And again, the biggest pain point was onboarding because you had no artifacts to give to a person when they joined.
Yeah, and Scott, I recall as well from our planning session, you had mentioned we had talked about the sort of the onboarding, but you had mentioned, you know, when you get in seat, to sort of start to take stock in what tasks you're required to manage. And you know, that will start to give you that foundation to looking at some of those pieces through Chris's lens, which is if you do it more than once, you know, maybe it's time to see if there's some way we can be more efficient and drive some type of operational excellence around this task, because it's a task that's going to probably be repetitive. Do you want to expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, at its most basic form, you're trying to pick the right resource to do something, right? And I think that when I think about it, I think in terms of two axes. You know, one is level of business knowledge that you need to have in order to complete that task effectively. And then another one is the amount of expertise that you need to have in order to effectively do that job. When I think about the upper right quadrant, which effectively, you know, I would just assume that if you're going to hire a general counsel, chief legal officer, it is the maximum amount of business knowledge with the maximum amount of expertise, and you take that. And then when I think about for any given piece of work that falls within that spectrum, there's also a kind of piece of how many repetitions are you going to have at this. And so in some boxes, you're going to find that you don't need a lot of business. You don't need a lot of business knowledge because it is, it's something that it's just kind of, it's a little bit more repetitive. I don't call it an SEC filing, and you do it quarterly. You can probably go to outside counsel, high expertise, low repetition, and go and pick that off out of the law firm. So that one's pretty easy. And then you end up with these, you know, more challenging pieces, whether it's a regulatory question that keeps coming up because you're running global, you know, clinical trials, whether it's a privacy question, whether it's a contracting question, and then you end up with these like really interesting questions around, gosh, I'm doing this a lot. I feel like I'm doing it more over time. I feel like as we continue to do this, the need to engage with the business gets higher. And then so now you're kind of stuck between, how do I hire somebody externally? I don't really want to hire somebody internally. And you get into these really interesting resourcing questions about how to go attack things that tend to be increasing in frequency, but you can't quite figure out if it's episodic or not. So I think that's where the most interesting questions are. I think that biotech, I'm sure other industries lend themselves to interesting questions like this, but I think from a resourcing perspective, biotech is hard. You know, you ostensibly, if you're going to stand up a phase 2 study, there's a large bolus of work with a long tail associated with it. But you kind of got to figure out, do you need a full-time employee to stand up that large bolus of work because it's a high touch point with the business? Is that better outsourced? If it is outsourced or insourced, what is the right playbook associated with it? Do I even have the time to put together a playbook because we just got our phase 1 proof of concept data and we just got invested in, and now all of a sudden I went from like picking up scraps on the floor for lunch to, Scott, you have all the money that you could ever need because we just completed a financing. Now we need to get into clinic, and our next catalyst for financing is going to be when this phase 2 completes. And we can't complete it until we get this thing enrolled, and we can't get it enrolled unless you give us all the contracts. So tell us what you need, right? So you end up with these like really feast famine type episodic occasions. You can kind of see them coming, but it is unique. I think it does create its own set of industry challenges around how you decide what resources to put at what problems. And I do think that frequency of occurrence is one thing, but then you also need to be a business partner and look into the future and think, gosh, are we going to be doing this? Are we going to be lucky enough to be, progressing from phase 1 to phase 2, from phase 2 to phase 3? If everything goes right, are we going to transition from a development stage company to being a commercial company with an R&D pipeline as well? Are the things that I'm putting in place now, will they scale? Do they need to scale? And to the extent that you want to pre-invest in some of these processes, I think it's great. I think the most important thing is that you're thinking about it and that you're very intentional about whatever the resources you're putting in place now, whether that will or will not scale. And you just need to remind yourself, I intentionally did something that was a little bit of a Band-Aid here, and I need to fix that if I have the luxury of moving forward into bigger studies.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because Factor focuses on contracts and contracting, that is one of the challenges that we see across all industries. But absolutely, I don't think it's felt as acutely as it is in the biotech space for the reasons of how those organizations run, which is, to your point, we're small, got some financing, we have a technology that we need to see if it's viable. And if it's viable, now suddenly, also depending on, the therapeutic area or the type of technology, now suddenly it's going to blow up. So it's thinking about that scalability. And, in that sense, it creates sort of this bias towards outsourcing, which is part of, a big part of our business and why I think we've had so much success in that business. And then, sort of during those kind of quiet times in between, you can sit down and sort of think about building process and preparing for that next sprint, right? Which is going to be, you get out of your phase 2 where you have other candidates, or programs that are developing and also moving through the clinical trial process. You can start to think about that scalability, but inevitably a lot of this does come back to resourcing challenges, right? And, you also don't want to suddenly say, okay, well, I need 10 lawyers because I've, multi-jurisdictional or multi-site trials, so I'm going to hire 10 people. That's not really probably able to be done in a timely fashion. And then on top of that, you have, okay, well, we don't know what the results are going to be, so I don't want to hire 10 people just to let go 10 people because that doesn't feel good to me or the organization. It's also treated differently from a cost perspective. And then you have all of the, hiring, firing regulations that come around with that.
So let me just jump in there. Karl,
Yeah, please.
A couple of things that I wanted to comment on. First of all, I think if you wait until you're in that sprint, which is when I first brought in an external help at CGen, and it wasn't Factor, it was another group. And I remember the lead there said to me, "Man, you guys are you're drowning, but you're too busy drowning to even think about swimming for the life ring." And that is true, right? I mean, you don't have the thinking time. So somehow or another, you've got to create that space to think about this and put in place some things. And I do think sort of external help is that's where it's valuable. And one of the observations I've made about lawyers is we in contrast to other departments that quite often reach out externally and bring in a consultant, lawyers seem perennially reluctant to do so. But, you know, outside counsel is a consultant. It's not really that different. And, you know, one of the things that I've noticed again is if you do stand up and again, and be smart about it, you know, have a defined statement of work, have a defined project. But I have found that one of the hidden benefits of working with a consultant, be it Factor or somebody else, is there's a project and there's a work plan and then there's a cadence of meetings, and then you break that cycle of being too busy drowning to think about swim for the life ring, because after some period of time, again, maybe start small, maybe do a pilot, but after some period of time of these regular meetings and working a plan, you look up and it's like, man, actually, look, we got somewhere. You know, we've done this thing. And then I think Scott mentioned credibility with the business. You've got a little bit more. You know, maybe you can do something else then. So I guess that's an extension of how'd you start? You know, maybe you do work with somebody, but you do a pilot, you build that credibility, you build your own experience working with them. But using that consultant to help you is sometimes a way of creating that space initially to think.
Yeah, sure. Frees up capacity, but also brings, you know, that a more robust project management based approach. It does drive, it's going to drive that accountability. So it checks off a bunch of those boxes. But I think, Chris, it also, what you're talking about again, and Scott, you as well, reinforces sort of that starting early. Like, you know, most folks at a biotech, this might be their first GC role at a biotech, but it's not their first time in a biotech, because I doubt they would get hired not having pharmaceutical experience, given how unique that industry is. So, you know, they understand, just like you guys do, okay, I know where this could go. So I know what the legal needs will probably look like when if it goes in the direction that we all hope it does, and creates a viable product that will then get marketed, because that's another area where we see companies quite overwhelmed, is they're thinking about the today. I've got to get these contracts out. I also need to look at these financing transactions. I've got these IP transactions. Maybe we have some higher retention issues, if people coming in and out, because that's also typical of a biotech. But on top of that, if I can start to think about all of the legal needs that are going to arise, that's sort of putting on that legal operations hat and saying, how am I going to tackle all of these? And you need to start that early, because it's too hard to do it when you're in the middle of it. I did want to touch on, we've mentioned, the word technology has come up a couple times. We certainly have a position on that, but I'd love, both of you to think about, again, if you're in that early stage biotech, how are you guys viewing the role of technology in supporting either your day-to-day or the legal teams, especially in those early stages?
Yeah, I guess one of the things when I entered or stepped into what is formally called legal operations, you could be fooled into thinking that you are not doing legal operations unless you are implementing a CLM. I can tell you that that is the furthest thing from the truth. We did just implement a CLM. It is as burdensome of a project as advertised. I think we're more successful than others because we did start thinking about some of the things like Chris mentioned in advance. And if you do that, you're going to better position yourself. And I do think that it is sometimes seen as a benchmark of the evolution of a legal department to adopt that kind of pretty heavy piece of technology. I don't think it's because of the technology itself. It's because you really need to get your processes in order to actually implement the piece of software. It's more about that process design, template rationalization, playbooking that happens before you can actually kind of code into and customize that system. So I've seen kind of all of it. I was, like I said, Department of One, saving things on my desktop and like trying to get my files right. And I would call that, kind of my first iteration of legal technology, which was trying to figure out what my file hierarchy was going to be so I could actually find stuff. All the way through, hiring a legal operations manager and implementing a piece of software. I would say, like, my perspective of it now, having kind of seen all of that, is as I move forward, will put more reliance on external partners. And why I say that is because as a biotech company, you're just necessarily resource constrained. Like we just talked about, you're going to go through these kind of weird boom and bust cycles that have nothing to do with your department, but have everything to do with the success of whatever it is that you're trying to get to patients, together with the macroeconomic factors of when you're going to be able to finance the business. And the legal department is always going to be riding in the back seat there and supporting the rest of the business. I think that as we plan resourcing and we thought about budget allocated to FTEs, budget allocated to external lawyers, external partners, ALSPs, and external technology, I think we saw the future that we did need to figure out how to scale our contracting function, which is why we decided to implement a contract management system. But in terms of additional technologies, I think we went through that experience, and our collective perspective as a legal department was, gosh, we really wish that our external partners that are doing a lot more thinking about this would help us think more about this instead of trying to insource a lot of the technology. Because I do think that, we are here to help the business develop therapies for patients. We are very clear that our job as an in-house legal counsel is not to advance the future of legal technology. If there's something that we can use as a tool, great. Likely it's going to be in bite-sized pieces of that tool, and hopefully we can go buy that on an episodic basis from our outside partners.
Yeah, Chris, look, you love your insight as well, but I did just want to pick up one thing, Scott. We do a lot in the CLM space, and the first we know how we live through. We're not tech implementers, but we do all of the other implementations. We're not coders, but we'll help with the process, workflow design, user requirements, all of that. And one of the first things we typically ask in the first conversation where we're approached is, what is your what's your current state? And I think a lot of technology implementations have failed, and I think a lot of people are just bombarded with, there's so much accessibility to Gartner report on, here's the top 10 and here's this use case and here's this webinar on how this CLM saved our lives. But they're enablers of process, right? And if you don't have those processes in place, it's going to make the purchase isn't going to drive the value you hope it does. It's going to probably make the internal working environment even worse. And I think not enough of the market is honest that technology is a game changer, but that doesn't mean you have to buy the biggest, best technology right now. That might not be what's right for your organization. It's what can you leverage that's going to help you start to even think about applying some form of technology. And I think you had mentioned hey, it's okay if you have a SharePoint. Now, it's not okay if you have a SharePoint 1,000 lawyers, then you're going to have all kinds of other issues. But when you're first starting out, it's okay if you're using something that is more rudimentary, but it's still going to help you potentially track obligations, understand the status of where your contracts are. And then, Chris, did you?
Sure.
Oh, sorry. So we're using the term CLM, that's contract lifecycle management. So contract lifecycle management is not just about technology; it's about all of the processes from. I just saw a question pop up. It's all of the processes from intake through execution. That is contract lifecycle management. How are contracts getting requested? How are they getting negotiated? Where are they being stored? How are you managing the obligations? So for folks that are on here, if you hear CLM, don't think that means just means technology. It actually means the entire process of contracting from intake through post-obligation management.
Yeah. So I also have sort of scars from implementing a CLM, the technology solution. And, what is remarkable to me is there are so many smart people in biotech, but I've seen so many smart people just lose their mind over CLM and the expectations that they think this technology solution is going to deliver. I mean, literally, people talking about, oh, and you'll upload the draft and it'll do an automatic red line and this and that and the other and this and maybe in theory, but I think real contract lifecycle management system as distinct from a technology solution is about people, process, and then technology. Because if you don't have the right people and you don't have the right processes that are documented and you bring in technology, you'll just do sort of bad, inefficient work faster, or maybe not even faster, but it'll just be a recipe for frustration. So I think, I mean, I have no plans to bring in a CLM. I mean, Karl, we've got an arrangement for contracting with Vector, and we get some of the benefits of a CLM in the way of reporting and things without actually having one. And one of the reasons I like that is the other sort of sting in the tail of a CLM that I found at CGen was then you need somebody to maintain it, and that's somebody in IT. And I like legal, IT is also resource constrained, and there's kind of like a hierarchy. And if finance has got to close the books, then the ERP is going to get more attention than the CLM. If you're in a clinical trial, then technology solutions that handle clinical data are going to get a lot more attention than the CLM. So one of the stings in the tail was we struggled with the CLM, and part of it was that we were the bottom of the pecking order for IT. And again, I'm not blaming them. They were just probably appropriately prioritizing. But that kind of meant that, again, I got a primer. We never had a business analyst. We had a systems analyst trying to be a business analyst. And I didn't even know what these terms meant, but like they came out because I went to see the head of IT, and the guy was also called Chris. And I said to the head of IT, I said, I love Chris, he's a great guy, but I can't understand what he says to me. And when I speak to him, it's pretty clear he doesn't understand me. Head of IT said, oh, that's because he's a systems analyst. He's not a business analyst. And I'm like, well, what is that? It's like the systems analyst is the more core techie person that keeps things up and going. And the business analyst is the one that can translate a people process into sort of technology and translate. And we never had one, largely because they were just resource constrained. And practically, I mean, I'm joking, but practically it was a real problem that we had a technology solution that we never got the benefit of. So I would delay. And any solution, I would ask yourself, what are we actually going to do with it? I mean, because even with reports
and what problem are we trying to solve for?
what problem, like there really aren't that many people that are interested in reports about contracting. I mean, maybe for a clinical trial they are, because they want to compress that timeline. So maybe that's the only time. Other people generally report, they care about theirs, but they don't care about reporting. The idea of alerts about things are coming up about expiration, the people sort of throw out because they can imagine it, but how many people really are going to care and act on it? So I do think you can delay. I mean, again, look at more simple technologies where you have a clear use case, to your point, a clear problem that you are solving.
Yeah, and again, you know, building on that, if you're trying to manage 1,000 suppliers, you know,
Yeah.
that you know, you can't have a rudimentary system. You know, you could find yourself, you don't want, you know, auto renewals kicking in. You don't want to be missing payment terms and obligations. You don't want to be increasing risk because you have, you know, you're deviating in the way that you're engaging with your counterparties, different payment terms. You know, finance hates that.
This goes back to the point that Scott made earlier, though, about thinking like a business. Because if you're not very careful, you maybe you're making a case for a CLM and you're saying things like that, and the people on the other side, maybe even in finance or whatever, like glazing over, like that's not us. That's not us yet. I mean, one day maybe,
Right.
but it just isn't us yet. And you know, and they won't tell you, you know, they won't tell you that they're disregarding what you're saying. So I think it is kind of understanding, to your point, what's the problem you're solving.
Yeah, and you had made a point about approaching any technology strategically because there are certain technologies that can be a game changer. I mean, we're doing, I think one of the other areas where everybody will be able to take advantage of sort of this new world of AI is in contracts and contracting because they're, you know, unlike a CLM, which again is right for an organization at a certain scale and level of maturity, but there's now a way to get the benefits of, you know, the redlining, the triage, the insight with a lot of the capabilities that are, you know, coming through with AI. That's, you know, and AI for more mature organizations, if they're on this call as well, can even get more out of their technology because these are things that can be deployed in weeks, not, you know, months and years, and can drive a ton of benefit, especially in the contracting space, but also, you know, the IP space, you know, litigation space, which I'm hoping a biotech isn't faced with those hurdles. You know, we're kind of at about 12 minutes left. I don't know if anybody that's still on has any questions. You know, please drop them in the Q&A. As I'm waiting to see if anything populates, I would just ask you guys, you know, if you had to give, you know, the new GC of a biotech advice on, you know, where to start, you know, both of you just give your ideas around that theme.
Before I do that, I'll pick up a quick note on Chris's because I think we gave what might seem like contradictory answers, but I actually agree with what Chris said. And then I think that there's a kind of overlap of the Venn diagram. I would also say wait to adopt big, heavy pieces of technology until you absolutely feel like you need it. When did we feel like we absolutely thought that we needed it? It was when we were in the middle of phase 3 studies and we started building a compliance organization around kind of launch date minus a year and a half. And we saw what the organizational build was going to look like to launch a drug. And that's when, from my perspective, SharePoint was not going to work anymore. And I also wanted to give us plenty of time to implement a system, work out the bugs so that we weren't, as Chris said, we weren't so busy drowning that we couldn't, you know, swim for the life raft. And, you know, also we weren't going to be so busy drowning that we couldn't build the boat. So we decided to invest into a CLM at that point. Other people could choose other points, but in terms of when did that switch flip for us, it was mid phase 3 studies. We saw an end date. We saw what our PDUFA date might be. We started building a compliance organization. Part of the compliance organization's questions to us were, when are we going to start building a CLM so that from a compliance perspective, we can take a look at what we're doing from a contracting not on the R&D side, but more specifically on the commercial side, how we're engaging with docs and folks in the field. So anyways, that was kind of where I see a big overlap in the Venn diagram there. To answer your question, Karl, you know, advice that I would give is consistent with what I said at the very beginning, is inventory your work. I think it's unique to everyone. I think, look, I figure out what you like doing and preserve that for yourself. And so that's going to be different. Like if you have an IP background, you're going to want to preserve some more of that work for yourself. If you have a corporate background, you're going to want to preserve some more of that work for yourself. And then from there, create just a little bit of a hierarchy and pay attention to volumes as they wax and wane. Things that are not waxing and waning and only increasing in frequency, you're going to need to develop a plan sooner than later. And things that are waxing and waning, I got to tell you, are going to be the hardest ones to go solve for in terms of episodic use of resources. Because when the volume is coming, it doesn't feel great. And it feels even less good when you know that this is only for a month. And so you kind of just do it. What I will tell you is the next time that wave peaks, if it took you 100 hours, you know, in the first time it peaked, the next time it peaked, just knowing how biotech progresses, it's going to be more than that. And it will be a little bit more painful. And so as you think about that lull period, think about resourcing for those episodic pain points and challenges that take you away from the work that you really like doing.
So I think Scott nailed it looking in at the legal department. So I'll go the other way and sort of look out of the legal department. I am a first time GC, somewhat perhaps late in my career. And so this is again going to sound no duh. But for the first time in my career, my boss isn't a lawyer. And so to go on this theme that's come up a couple of times about thinking like a business person, I think you have to, because you're not talking to lawyers anymore. And so the sorts of things that resonate and influence a lawyer may or may not resonate or influence them, particularly in biotech. You might be dealing with scientists. So they're influenced by data, whereas lawyers tend to be influenced by analogy. Right? So we're sort of trained, right, to distinguish cases. You're comparing things. You're using analogy, or comparing a current event to a prior event. Them like, I honestly, I think if you look at that, I think they're thinking, well, that's a small data set. It's like just two, right? And so again, I think making that pivot to thinking a little bit more like they, which might be data. Whereas again, lawyers are always like, oh, it's statistics, there are lies, damn lies and statistics. But it actually resonates more with colleagues outside of the legal department. So use it. And again, even the arguments that you're deploying, the lawyer's concern might be, compliance. Well, try and find some data on what's the cost of non-compliance. Actually, sort of it is out there, because that will resonate much more with them than, we might get, or the horror stories of enormous fines, because everybody will think, well, yeah, but they were really bad. We won't, we won't be that bad. So just remember, your boss is no longer a lawyer. Your peers are no longer lawyers. So you might have to start thinking about, well, how do they think? What resonates with them? How do I influence them? And it will be different because they don't have the same training and background as you.
That's a great way to end. I love that, especially because, again, if we're taking this from a legal operations perspective, I could kind of take both what you said, and then Chris, what you said, which is come in and inventory your workflow, understand, how long tasks need to take, understand what your strengths are and what interests you, because at the end of the day, you want your role to be fulfilling, and then pivot that to the fact that now you are, interacting and accountable. And you guys were doing this as lawyers in other large organizations as well, but it's not to the same level of intimacy as when you're at a biotech and, it's maybe the 5 of you in a room, the chief scientist, the CEO, maybe someone from regulatory, and then if you even have regulatory at that point, which you might not if you're that far away from commercial stage, so it's you don't want to show up and be the quote unquote the lawyer in the room. You want to show them that you're thinking about how are we going to make this, how are we going to get this technology, compliantly through the clinical trial phase? How are we going to protect the patients? How are we going to get this this access to people that need it down the road? And some of that has legal themes, but it's also thinking about, what's the business need? How can I be helping the business, not just coming in and saying, hey, I just do lawyer stuff. So a lot of that is, to free yourself up for that, it's, to come full circle, it's around, what is the operational environment that I need to build, and how do I build it and get the most efficiency with the dollars I have available, with the tasks that I know are coming and that I have day one, and potentially, down to year 3. So if there are no parting thoughts or questions, we wrap up close to on time, which I think is also a good thing to do. So I really appreciate Chris, Scott, you guys joining me. Love your insights. Wish you guys both continued success as well, because we do have some Q&A. Nope, it's a thank you. Okay, never mind. I'll take that as well. But again, wish you guys both continued success, and we'll stay in touch.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks all.
Take care.
Bye.